Good evening and welcome back to part 3 of our event. I'm now joined by Emma, Karl and Domini. Emma, tell us where you're tuning in from tonight.
Live from the cupboard under the stairs at home in Leicester.
Always glamorous, darling, always glamorous.
Always glamorous.
Karl, how about you? Where are you joining us from?
If I'm on mute, I'm joining you from my office, aka the spare room. There you go.
The spare room in London?
I'm trying to sound posh, darling. There you go. Not spare, very much used. Very much used.
Love it. And Domini, tell everyone where you're based.
I'm still at school. I'm in Bristol.
I was going to ask whether you had an interactive whiteboard on your bedroom wall, so I did think that you might still be at school. So you might have noticed that we are missing one of our speakers for this section. The lovely Lekka went to the dentist today, is unable to actually speak at the moment, so she sends her apologies. I've already got her booked in for next year, which means that these three who already struggle to speak are going to have to fill a bit more airtime. I'm sure we'll be okay with that. Is that okay to ask you to talk a little bit more tonight? So let me just introduce the text we're going to be talking about. So Karl has recently published his second book. There he is. He's showing us the marketing there. Action Hero Teacher 2, Teachers of the Lost Class is the book that Karl is going to be speaking about. Emma, I've lost track of how many books you've done now. This is your third book.
That's the fourth. The fifth one due out, and I've just got a contract for the sixth.
Oh my goodness me! I don't know how you do. I had the same conversation with Hailey. We will ask you about the kind of the volume in a second. So tonight you're talking about Simplicitus. Is that correct? The curriculum book, right. The interconnected primary curriculum and effective subject leadership. And Domini is here representing Representation Matters. So Aisha Samad is the author of the book that came out last year. She is, I don't know which country she's currently in, but she's got dodgy Wi-Fi, and she's roped in Domini, who's one of the associates from Representation Matters, to represent the book. So we didn't want to miss it from tonight. So Domini, thank you so much for joining us kind of last minute. So let me invite each of you just to retell us about how your book came into being, a bit about the process. I'm going to start with you, Karl, because it is the second in the kind of the duo. You might want to reference your first book and how the two speak to each other as well. So over to you.
No worries. Really quickly. So as I said, thank you very much. It feels like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. It's like, hello, Karl. I've been my name's Karl. I've been sober for 2 years. I wrote the first book, The Action Hero Teacher, in 2019, off a whim, really. I didn't have a book deal, book publisher, but I was really, at the time, the reason why I wrote The Action Hero Teacher 2 was that the way that behavior management was taught, I didn't like it. It was very much like, countdown 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I was like, no, not in inner city London. They're not going to like it. They're not going to like it. So I wrote The Action Hero Teacher 2. I think I sold 30 copies in the first year. One of them was to a supply teacher, which I coerced. I forced into buying it. And it was all about behavior management in the modern day. Then what happened was lockdown happened, and that's where I met you, Hannah, and you're one of the people that championed me, because you're saying, look, there's some great people here. And then my life changed forever. So now I'm an educational consultant full time, and I never thought I'd write another book again. I don't identify as a woman. I won't give birth, but it was an arduous task to write a book. And I thought, it's like what my wife says, I'll never do it again. And then she says, let's work on child number 2. And that's how I kind of felt with that, actually. Very controversial. My wife is listening. I love you, honey. I love you. I wrote The Action Hero Teacher 2 really quickly because what happened with COVID. And it felt like with most schools, it was pre-COVID and post-COVID. It was kind of like 9/11 for us. I'm sure we all remember 9/11. The world changed instantly. And I think we had another world-changing event. So I think behavior management has changed for various reasons. And I wrote all about it in Action Hero Teacher 2, how technology, COVID, and everything else is affecting our kids. So that's the rundown of it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Karl. And I mean, just for us to spotlight the fact that black men don't like books, do they? Like, let's think about education. Like, there's very few people of colour who have been published, but to be a man of colour, you're in a minorities group within the sector. What other books can you think of that a black man in education has written?
Absolutely. So really quick anecdote about that. When I first came up with the idea of the Action Hero Teacher, I remember saying to one of my black colleagues, I want to write the book. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. He said, Karl, it sounds like a brilliant idea, but don't bother writing it. And he wasn't saying it with any hate or anything. And I said, why not? And he said, because black men don't write books and they'll never take you seriously. I'll never forget that. And I went and did research. The only two authors before me that I could find, I could be wrong, was a guy called Bernard Cord, who wrote how the West Indian child was made educationally subnormal in the British education system. That was 1971. Then we had the very controversial Anthony Sewell, who wrote Black Masculinities in Schooling in 1999. And then there's now me, who was the third. So I said, you know, we're like buses. One comes every 20 years. So hopefully I'll have other books, so it won't take as long.
I love that. We've just had Stuart Lawrence on. I didn't know Stuart was a teacher until I met him on Zoom recently. We know Stuart from other his kind of like his current sphere. And obviously the lovely Jeffrey's published his book in the last year as well. So it's great to see a growing voice. But well done for putting yourself out there. So let me swing round to Emma to tell us about book 4 of 6. Your family's getting bigger and bigger. You need some bigger bookshelves now, Emma.
I know. Well, I'm living vicariously through my children. They're not my trophies.
Go for it.
Simplicitus was my first kind of, I won't say grown-up book, but it was the first non-autobiographical book, because Let's Talk About Flex and Be More Toddler were writing about my lived experiences in flexible working and in co-headship and doing leadership differently. So this was the first one that I wrote that was not based on anything I'd personally experienced, which was a completely different way of writing. And to be honest, I really needed a kick up the bum to write it, because I didn't believe that anybody would want to actually listen to anything proper that I had to say. But I was doing a lot of work around curriculum, and there were lots of people I was working with that said, you need to write this down. You need to put this in a book. There isn't anybody out there championing primary. There's lots of voices about curriculum, but very few from a kind of early years and primary perspective. What you're saying is really important. And I was like, well, really? And so I actually had an enormous amount of kind of encouragement, mentoring, proofreading from some trusted colleagues to get the book out there in the world. So it's been a very different writing experience, writing Simplicitus, than it was writing the other two, because I felt like nobody could challenge my lived experience, but I felt that they could challenge it if I was writing something that was, I don't mean more generic, but was more experienced by everybody else every day in the classroom. So it was a very, very different experience. And I was incredibly nervous when it first went out there into the world. I thought, oh my goodness, what if people don't like it? But it's been pretty well received, and the follow-up's coming out at the end of April. So,
and what's the follow-up called? What's the part 2 going to be, Emma?
The part 2 is based on lots of questions that, as I've been working with schools around the contents of Simplicitus, the same sort of questions keep coming up. How do we do this? How do we sort this problem? This is a kind of ongoing wicked problem that we have in the primary sector. So Simplicitus Altius, which is coming out in April, which means deeper simplicity, is looking in more detail at some of the specific problems faced by primary curriculum design and colleagues in the primary phase. Small schools, mixed age classes, integrating reading, all sorts of specific things rather than generic curriculum design.
And you've referenced it already, but I want to just go a little bit deeper, Emma, because I know we've spoken before about, like, you've banged out some of the other books, like, in quite a short amount of time, because your personal story, and you didn't have to go away and research it. You just need to get some time to write it. Was this process longer, more painful, because it was more referenced and researched? It
was more careful, because it was less emotive. I couldn't have it as an emotive story. It had to be this is a handbook of how to do it. And as much as I feel passionate about some elements of it, that can't can't be in there. So yeah, it was a more staged process, whereas the first two were quite cathartic, just to kind of get those stories out there. I was quite driven to write them. This one was a lot more kind of backwards and forwards in, with, like I say, trusted colleagues who would read bits and give feedback and say, yep, that's great. Or the biggest problem I had was actually making it, as one mentor was saying, you need to make it more academic. You've got to make it academic this time. And I was like, yeah, but what if people don't think that that's me? And so that was a real kind of professional kick up the bum. But it was a very, very different, enjoyable, but different process, writing from a informed standpoint rather than a lived standpoint.
And like, do you mean you're a fellow disruptive person, Emma? Like, we like to break the molds and remove the barriers and the obstacles. And like your personal narrative books are about how you've broken the mold as a leader. So you're breaking another mold, really, aren't you? But by then writing about a different genre completely.
Yeah. And when the sixth one that I'm writing is about cognitive science for primary, and again that was kind of a slightly disruptive thing, because a lot of the big voices, they give us a lot of gifts in terms of their knowledge about cognitive science, but not through a primary pedagogical lens. And there's been a lot of kind of lethal mutations in terms of how cognitive science has been applied in primary. So again, it's kind of a not disruptive, but a rebalancing. I felt that there wasn't enough balance in terms of the voices out there who were talking about cognitive science. So I put myself forward as the counterpoint.
That's probably the most carefully worded sentence I've ever heard you say. I'm going to say, like, white men write books about behaviour and white men write books about curriculum. And actually what you've both done is you've busted out a different perspective and voice and experience. And that's what's really important. And that's why you're here tonight. So thank you for taking that leap of faith. We appreciate it. So Domini, your involvement with the book is slightly different. Why don't you introduce yourself and your involvement with Representation Matters and an advocate for the book, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm sorry Aisha can't be here. She really did want to be. She's actually in Ghana. She's undertaking research with the University of Ghana for her PhD. And as she has said, the internet is a bit patchy over there. So she asked me if I'd come and talk. I'm an associate for her company, Representation Matters. So I do a lot of work as well as my day job, delivering race equality work in schools. And I'm an avid fan of her book. Yeah, just highlighting it again. It's brilliant. I've made use of it. I use it in my school. We have multiple copies of it. We engage staff in reading it, undertaking. I'll talk a little bit about what's in it and the kinds of activities that are. But it's really practical. That's what I love about the book. It's such a practical book to use for CPD, but also for your own journey and development as well. So I've it's going to be sounding a little bit weird because I'm going to talk in the third person, because I'm going to share Aisha's story of how she came to write the book. So she was an assistant principal in Bristol for several years, and that's how I first met her and worked closely with her. She's been working on equality and diversity issues for many years. Then she left the school environment to set up her company, Representation Matters. And what had happened is, when she was a senior leader, she was reading leadership book after leadership book, and there was no mention of race. She was reading books on teaching standards, and again, no mention of race. She read books about pedagogy, behavior, teaching and learning, yet she struggled to find many books that spoke about race. And she also saw the burden that was placed on very few teachers of colour to provide the answers and solutions to a lot of the problems that exist in our schools. That's something she and I have talked about passionately and have spoken about for years, and worked together on trying to actually change in Bristol. Aisha sees this book as an opportunity to amplify the voices of the marginalised and ensure that their authentic lived experiences are told. Also, with half of schools having no black or brown teachers at all, there often isn't a central place to start the journey. The word in the title, it says becoming an anti-racist educator, and the word becoming is deliberate because it recognizes that there isn't one fixed way of doing something, but becoming allows her to hold the mirror to her own existence for others to then perhaps do the same to theirs. And a big part of the book, particularly the beginning part, is focused on what representation means to different people, in the hope that their shared stories would resonate with others to bring the best version of themselves into the education space. And so she decided to start at the very beginning on why representation matters to her and how it's affected her journey in education. She talks about her own schooling in Bristol, born and raised in Bristol, and then her then moving into the education sector in Bristol as an educator, and that journey. And for Aisha, the word representation is so intrinsically linked with the words strong, female, and black. It's the intersectionality of all three that compounds her experience. And just a bit of background about how she started this. There was a very specific incident that acted as a catalyst for her. She used to be a lawyer, actually, had a brief career in law before she moved into education. And it started with a young man in prison that she was visiting. And she'd always been aware of the disproportionate numbers of Black and brown children and young people in prison and young adults. And one day when she was visiting the prison, she found herself in the middle of a mass move, which is when all prisoners are moved to various locations across the site. And then she was surrounded by a sea of faces, and she was a bit scared and overwhelmed. But what stuck out to her the most was that she was surrounded by Black and brown young men that made her question, how can this be? And what's happening to our Black and brown children and young people? And the prisoner that she had come to visit said to her that perhaps if she had been his teacher, he wouldn't be in prison today. And he didn't literally mean her, but what it meant to see a Black person in a position of authority, power, being a decision maker. The prisoner talked about representation, and he explained that all the people in power that he'd come across in his life are white. And he talked about he'd only seen himself in sport, media, or crime represented in those areas. And this was the catalyst for Aisha to move into education and begin this journey.
Domini, thank you so much. I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second because I'm just thinking about the links here between why Aisha wrote her book and actually Karl's book. And thinking about like who's leading schools and who's doing behaviour and the fallout of when young people don't see themselves reflected. Karl, I can see you nodding lots as Domini was speaking then. Do you want to just share some reflections on Aisha's catalyst?
Well, it's really tragic, actually. What I was nodding was it goes by what's been in the research that's been done. So David Lammy, when he was the shadow criminal justice secretary, I might have got that wrong, but basically he looks at the prisons and looks at how we as a society do to get these young people back into society. And 51% of all young people are global majority citizens, Black and brown citizens. And that's in youth offenders. We know that Black children, especially Caribbean boys, now it's Caribbean girls that are going up as well, are 4 to 8 times more likely to be excluded. We call this a school to prison pipeline. And I know from my lived experience that if it wasn't for my mentor, I was very lucky at the age of about 16, 17, I had an uncle who basically took me under his wing and made me this charming, handsome man that you see in front of you. Well, maybe my parents made me the handsome man, but you get the idea. And he changed my life because he was the one that put values into me. And I'll never forget, I said, his name was Eric. And I said, Uncle Eric, I said, you've changed my life. What can I do? And he said, do for others what I did for you. That's all you can do. Just pass it down. And what Domini was saying about Aisha's story when she said, if you were my teacher, I would have not, been in this position. I've spoken to many young men, many young women who I know are on the cusp. And it's not only because of their particular circumstances, but it's a way that the system has been constructed. And it's not only, people only look at the exclusionary measures in the regards of, so for example, overt racism, but we don't look at the subtle, the covert methods that the system do. And that's why I wrote the Action Era Teacher, because, I wanted to take it from a more holistic view, rather than just say, if they're not misbehaving, you send them out, because that's what starts the school to prison pipeline. So that's why I really thank you, Domini, for really saying such a striking story, because it resonated. And that's the mission of AHT, to try and make it more equitable for everybody. It's not about Black lives mean more or Asian lives mean more. It's everybody's lives mean more. Everybody deserves a fair shake. And unfortunately, looking at this government, not to get political, it's not a fair shake for many people. So it's trying to even that playing field.
Thank you, Karl. I'm going to come back to Domini and then back to Emma. So Domini, I'm just thinking about the format of actually having you talking about the application of the book. Might be how I do a future event, because I could get each person talking about the book they've written, but actually how we apply it. Because I think one of the criticisms is, are there too many edgy books now? Like, how do we know which one to read? So can you tell us a little bit, Domini, about how it's informed your practice? You're a deputy head, aren't you, in a school in Bristol? So tell us a little bit about the application of the learning from the book.
Yeah, so I think the thing is there's three really clear sections to the book that's really helpful if you're a senior leader, particularly, and thinking about your staff CPD. So the first bit is about you and starting with you, and that is so important because you can't lead on any work like this in your organization if you're not doing some reflection and review of yourself as well as your organization. So gets you to think about your core beliefs and values. And I already mentioned there's just loads of activities and loads of reflection questions. Actually encourages you to make notes in the book and really engage with it. And then it gets you to review and audit all aspects of your practice, your department, or your school as a whole. And also, so then the second part of the book is about seeking feedback from the stakeholders in your school, so your pupils, and how you go about that. How do you go about talking to young people about race? How do you get their views? And staff and the wider school community, parents, governors as well. So that's the middle part of the book. And then the last part of the book, the third section, is about then how do you turn all of that into an action plan. And it's really thinking about, well, we often want to jump to the how because that's where the work takes place, but it's about, well, how are you going to get there, the journey, that it's not a bolt on, that you need to weave it into your school's culture. I talk a lot about how important it is that the work you do to increase representation on race equality needs to be embedded into your school improvement plan. And Aisha's book talks about that a lot. It needs to be every part of your school improvement. And so there's just a lot of practical activities. It's got mini activities, reflection questions, discussion points, and work that you can do with your faculty, with your staff in CPD, actual activities and discussion points as well. There's loads of anecdotes, and that's the other thing, a range of educators and students, and the anecdotes are really helpful to help you to contextualize your understanding of representation and why it matters so much. So sharing those anecdotes with staff in CPD, getting them to put themselves in the shoes of others is really important. And every chapter ends with the summary of the key learning points, the self-reflection questions, discussion points as well. But I just want to add, there's one bit I wanted to add, is about the bit I loved the most in the book, the bit that resonated with me personally really deeply, is there's a section on racial trauma. And it is then contextualized with the lived experiences of some young people. And the reason that's my favorite part of the book is because it really did help me to understand the long-term impact of discrimination and racism. And I'm also the designated safeguarding lead in my school, so that's really important for me to think about. But it also got me to reflect on my own racial trauma as a child and then as an adult of color. So that was really important.
Thank you, Domini, because quite often in schools, well, maybe in a secondary school, it's a silo, isn't it? It's what happens in pastoral, what happens in the curriculum, but actually the integration of the two. So, Emma, I want to pick up a couple of threads here from the kind of the Representation Matters curriculum book, particularly this idea of like theory into practice. Because I know you're a deeply practical person, Emma, and getting that balance of the kind of the research and the theory, like. Yeah. How do you go about that, and what sort of feedback are you getting about how people then pick up your book and kind of run with it?
It's interesting because in Simplicitus there's a whole chapter on a curriculum of belonging and how important it is that all of this needs to start with the children at the youngest point. I mean, I often talk about primary as the receiving line of formal education, and that actually as in primary, I talk about the fact we have to take children by the hand and welcome them into the curriculum and say, hello, here you are, and have them represented in our curriculum, but also to take them over and kind of look out the window and the door and go, come with me, and there's all of this out of here as well. So here's you represented in our curriculum. You can see yourself, we can anchor you here, and then we can show you lots of other things as well. So practically, I talk to schools a lot about where do children see themselves in your curriculum. How do you actively forge links with the communities and the families that you serve? And how much do you know about the people and the places and the experiences that are important to the children who are in your school? And how do you anchor that in your work day to day? Because I think we get so raveled up in trying to do lots and lots of kind of knowledge-rich curriculum, which is academically very important. But if in primary we're the receiving line, we have to welcome and anchor children into our curriculum provision. And that's something, it's a huge privilege to be the people that say, come on in and meet education. And we need to do an awful lot of work. And I do an awful lot of work with schools about how children can see children similar to themselves and children who maybe look, feel, think or experience things differently from them, and how they're represented as well. So I think that the practicality at primary level is huge, both in terms of what you write into your curriculum and then how you welcome children into the education system, because we are in primary school for formal education, the receiving line. We've got to get it right.
And just to add to that, Emma, like the idea of how as curriculum leaders we bring in the pupil and the parent voice, like how we get the stakeholder voice involved. Like what's your take on that? And is there anything in your book about the kind of the listening activities?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in that curriculum of belonging about how well do you know the communities that you serve? You know, who is important to the people who live in your community? What places are important to them? You know, what are children's personal geographies and how is that represented in your curriculum? You know, have you actually been around in the community that you serve? What links do you actively forge with other community groups, other people who might have information to help you to support the families and the children that you serve? Because the big strapline all the way through Simplicitus is curriculum is an act of service. So actually what we're trying to do is to serve our communities in a way that supports the children that we teach in our schools, but actually encourages them to feel like they belong to our school community as well. So there's a whole thing in there about actively seeking information and connection with the communities that you serve and not making those assumptions that this is what happens here or this is what has always happened here. And also being really mindful that communities change very quickly, that you can very quickly have a big change in a community that you serve, and it's being vigilant to that and being sensitive to that and being, I don't mean reactive, responsive to that as well. So who are you serving in your curriculum and how can you serve them? How can you serve these different people best with your curriculum offer?
Yeah, brilliant, Emma, taking us really full circle back around. But I'm also just listening to you and thinking about some of the different narratives here about we haven't got diverse adult voices out there, but how do we perhaps help young people find their voice? Like how do we create the next generation of writers? Karl, how do we get more black boys putting pen to paper and perhaps sharing their stories? Have you got any thoughts about the next generation and them becoming writers?
If I could answer that question and implement it, I'll be a millionaire. I'll have myself a nice Porsche. With the time allotted to me, I think representation matters, like Aisha's book. Children, as I always say, children can't be what they can't see. There was extremely quickly, there was a study by Vanderbilt University that was actually charting Barack Obama's first inaugural run. And what they did was they got a group of young black boys to watch the runs and then get them to take tests. And when Obama was doing very well, because in America, the gap, I think, is like 10 points or 10%, it virtually disappeared. Every time they were watching that and they got invigorated. So it was kind of proof to show that if you've got representation and you see yourself doing well in other people, it shows that you can do it. It's the Pygmalion effect on steroids. So what we've got to do is just keep on pushing diverse voices, keep on pushing brilliant voices like Emma, of course, Aisha, with the help of Domini, yourself, and then things will change. Until that happens, we can talk and put as many black squares on social media and talk about, Me Too and, all these rights. But until we are active and we go and start dominating these spaces or start sharing these spaces, nothing will change. That's my thoughts.
Absolutely. I'm going to add to that it's also about us then getting these books onto the reading lists. So like Benny and I always do a whoop when we find out that Diverse Educators Manifesto is now on a lot of PGCE reading lists, and we hope to get it on MPQH reading lists. Like for us to not only get the book published, but to then disrupt the kind of the thought leadership space, that's perhaps something for us all to think about. Like, are these books on your staff CPD shelf in your staff room, but are they actually in the library where your trainees go as well? Any thoughts on that, Emma, about how we can perhaps influence the kind of the reading list on the MPQs as an example?
Again, if I had the answer to that one, Hannah. But I think it's not being afraid to question reading lists and to say who curated this, who collated this list, how diverse is it? Have we got representation for the sector, and not being afraid to be the person to ask that question, and not to just to accept that this is the full list, to actually say, well, actually this would be a great addition, or this is a great counterpoint to that, or this is a great complement to this. So I think championing wider reading, and if you are in a position to deliver any CPD yourself, is to actively signpost a wide range of different authors, and not to just default to the ones that people may already know about. So it's actively signposting every time you have a voice, every time you have a bit of airtime, is saying, and this, and how about that? We all know about this, how about this one? So it's that active championing whenever you have that airtime.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard of some really good practice from different teaching school hubs and trusts where every time they quote someone, they have to reference it, put the name, put the face. So we're consciously thinking about, are we just listening to dominant voices from a particular demographic, or are we consciously curating diverse perspectives? I think that's a really good sort of best practice to steal. I'm going to wrap up. Oh, go on, Emma, go finish.
Sorry, I was just going to say, there was one thing that I did with a group of schools when they were looking at their reading list, and we looked at every single kind of qualification that anybody could do, or any course, and we laid out all the books. If you went through their entire courses, who would you hear? And then we looked at the overall offer and looked at it. So each book in its own little window had its merit, but as a diet, it was actually very narrow. So it's looking at that overall picture as well.
Yeah, love it. We do that for the reading spines in our schools, but to do that for the reading journey of the adult learner, I think that's a really, really good best practice there. Emma, thank you so much. I'm going to wrap up part 3. So thank you so much, Emma, Karl and Domini, for joining us. Really appreciate the work you're all doing, but also that you've given us some time tonight to talk about it. And I'm going to give out all the social media handles so people, I'm sure, will reach out. But go and have your dinner, or leave school, Domini, go home. Fab to see you all. I'll be back very shortly with our part 4 speakers. Thank you and see you soon.